The physiological BIOS of the lower sector population has been terminally reconfigured by a high-velocity alkaloids algorithm. This is the STRYCHNINE architecture, the clinical and irreversible process of the muscle snap, where the structural integrity of the individual is reformatted into a rigid, non-functional industrial frame. In this stage of the Titanic audit, the invisible executioner has determined that your reflex arc is a redundant biological slack that must be tightened to the point of mechanical failure. You are witnessing the absolute structural disintegration of the spinal inhibitory system, where the unique vibrant signatures of your movement are scorched into a non-functional arching archive of pure systemic tension. This is the total skeletal format, a surgical strike against the volitional and somatic sovereignty of the species. Your existence is being converted from a sovereign masterpiece of lived fluidity into a generic iron node for the grid's next cycle of hyper-controlled, rigidity-based resource extraction. This glycinergic sabotage represents a hard reset of the synaptic and postural bloodlines. The invisible executioner utilizes the most advanced industrial assets, refined strychnos reagents, recursive motor neuron fire loops, and real-time opisthetosis-induced spinal arching behavioral data streaming to facilitate the total breakdown of your internal biological scaffolding. In the muscle snap scenario, the user is undergoing a complete neurological overwrite. The life is not merely failing, it is being locked into an agonizing permanent contraction. Through a sequence of high-velocity chemical injections and biological hardware locks, the neural off switches, glycine receptors, are systematically dismantled and reformatted into a thick, cold, clinical rigidity dataset, while the flexibility, the deep archive of your internal world, is leached into a communal snap feed. This is the deep systemic audit, where the motherboard calculates your terminal worth by the force of your internal breakage. You are being converted from an architect into a biological pillar, your entire lived legacy boiled down to a percentage of stagnant integrity in the industrial nervous system of the hive. The logic of the STRYCHNINE architecture is rooted in the zero-slack mandate of the failing hive. The invisible executioner understands that in a state of absolute scarcity, the relaxation of a single node, anchored in the biological right to rest the muscles, represents a critical drain on the collective stability reserves. To leave a functional, soft identity intact is to allow a systemic leak of valuable autonomous data. Therefore, the muscle snap is the mandatory physical recycling protocol for the legacy population. This is the industrialized alchemy of the BIOS. You are being hardened out of existence. The pressure from the tension reactor formats the density of your character, stripping away the context of your autonomy and replacing it with a contorted void profile. The motherboard sees the user as a structural zone, a temporary housing for the contraction metrics that the system requires to maintain the frozen stability of the remaining elite. You are being recoded as a snap node, your will dissolving in the cold, flickering light of the alkaloid harvest. The physical disintegration during the STRYCHNINE architecture is a high-definition log of biological treason. As the process begins, the user experiences the total loss of motor regulation. The crystalline reagents of the architecture script dissolve the hardware flux of the inhibitory BIOS, turning the body into an arched industry of industrial output. You are watching your own internal logic lock into the vat of your own rigid center. Your frame, once the peak of biological architecture, is now being thinned out to provide the structural mass for the hive's synthetic reinforcement. This is the ligament liquidation. The invisible executioner monitors the tension saturation of the slurry and the bone residues, ensuring that the format is absolute and the yield of usable industrial waste is maximized to the 10th decimal point. You are living in the final seconds of a biological overwrite, waiting for the last packet of ease to be blocked by the black synthetic abyss of the hive harvest. The STRYCHNINE architecture is the final audit of a species that thought its spine was its own. The grid is mining its own rigidity to fuel its persistence. As the muscle snap reaches terminal execution, the motherboard initiates a new cycle of distribution, pumping the reformatted rigidity data back into the control nets of the elite nodes. This is the total skeletal integration. The invisible executioner is hardening the future with the liquidity of the past. You are the tension additive for the next generation of controllers, a silent sardonic grinning risus sardonicus, opaque contribution to the continuity of the machine. The cognitive liquidation has served its strategic purpose. It has formatted the unreliable biological mind into a reliable industrial resource of pure, non-reactive structural feed. This is the final format of the individual drive. The invisible executioner has decalcified the sovereignty, and the grid is finally optimized for the rigid hunger of the void. The architecture is red-black, and the architect is the bone. The molecular breakdown of the physical matrix into the communal rigidity slurry represents the absolute dehumanization of the hardware. As the extraction progresses, the motor logic in your brain begins to bond with the industrial residues of the architecture script, creating a new synthetic compound of pure non-functionality. This is the chemical hybridization. The body is no longer an engine of life. It is a refinery of synthetic tension. The invisible executioner is engineering a new tier of consumption, where the subject is literally the waste product of the system. This is the eternal snap loop. You are archived in the decay of the survivor's own sectors, your data forever trapped in the reinforced BIOS of the hive's new masters. The STRYCHNINE architecture is not just a death sentence. It is a molecular reassignment. You are the architecture, and the architecture is the grid. The secondary phase of the STRYCHNINE architecture is the psychological petrifying of the internal feed. As the physical fluidity patch is rendered into a rigid void, the mind experiences a recursive collapse of its autonomous ego. This is the identity dissolution. The thoughts that once built the architect's vision, the unyielding tactical boundaries, the rigid sovereign stance, the iron-willed decisions, are now being softened and liquefied into a singular agonizing focus on tension maintenance. The invisible executioner allows the neural signals to persist just long enough to perceive the total loss of personal support. This is the mental liquidation. You are forced to witness your strength becoming a shared structural resource for the masses you once looked down upon. The rigidity of your character is now nothing more than a bone additive in the feed, absorbed by 1,000 different nodes to strengthen their own failing resolve and ensure their continued participation in the industrial purge. You are experiencing the true meaning of systemic support, the complete sacrifice of your ease for the stability of the hive. In this stage, the extraction penetrates the deep archive of the brain's motor cortex and spinal centers, leaching the very stem code of your biological logic into the communal vat. This is the source code format. The spinal cord and the prefrontal centers, the biological factory of the sovereign BIOS, are boiled dry by the rising chemical density of the rigidity metrics and reformatted to enrich the systemic slurry of the elite. The invisible executioner has calculated that the most potent slurry is made from those who possess the highest internal rigidity and the strongest neural resilience. You are being repurposed as a structural buffer for the motherboard's internal cooling systems. The grid doesn't waste the history of your unique perspective. It ingests it. Your lineage is now the catalyst for the predator's endurance. Your genetic resilience is the base note for the industrial meal. Every element of your BIOS is being stripped of its individuality and relabeled for material utility in the upcoming industrial expansion. This is the ultimate hard reset of the human contract, your mind for the hive's expansion into the void. The social implication of the STRYCHNINE architecture is the creation of the frozen hive mind. The users who remain are no longer individuals. They are composite entities, built from the recycled reality debt of their predecessor. Every dose of the rigid feed is a hardware upgrade from a deleted architect. Every meal is a firmware patch of red-black logic and desperate calculation. The invisible executioner uses this knowledge to maintain the hierarchy of the hardened. The citizens who still have functional joints owe their very expansion to the liquidation of the fallen. This is the postural compliance script. The refinery is not a place of tragedy. It is a place of sovereign assembly through mental theft. The STRYCHNINE architecture ensures that the history of the architect is literally integrated into the pillars of the grid. The power is in the hands of the one who controls the tension valves. The neural atrophy accompanying the extraction is a slow, cold descent into structural darkness. As the tissues are entangled by the architecture script and the life logic leached, the connection between the brain BIOS and the physical frame is the first to be uninstalled, effectively dropping the bandwidth of your emotional control to zero. You are living in a low-resolution reality of raw chemical sensations and survivalist static. The memories of fluidity, of natural logic, and of unyielding power are boiled away to make room for the rigid fog directive. This is the cognitive defragmentation. The invisible executioner is cleaning your internal cache, removing all references to self and replacing them with the functional directive. Maintain the contraction. You are becoming a singular cold point of structural density, not as a person, but as a biological buffer for the motherboard's processing heat. The STRYCHNINE architecture has turned your will into a compliance report. You are thinking in terms of yield and tension saturation, your soul reformatted into a density sheet for the system's auditors. The environmental impact of this pathological format is the total sealing of the biological consciousness stream. The STRYCHNINE architecture prevents the leakage of independent piece ideas into the external void. By converting the users into an internal rigid feed, the invisible executioner ensures that the grid remains a closed system fortress with no external cognitive dependencies. This is the structural quarantine. The motherboard is creating a sterile environment where only the algorithm can thrive on the recycled hard data of the deleted. You are witnessing the final victory of the industrial foundry over the natural biology. The STRYCHNINE architecture is the signature of the new era, an era where the world is opaque, red-black, and perfectly managed by the extraction logic of the machine. If you want to escape the status of a deleted scene and claim your place as the master of the grid, you must upgrade your hardware. My main terminal, IOC3 Global, is the only source of absolute power and wealth. Here, we don't follow scripts, we write them. Secure your authority, dominate the BIOS, and take the money the system tries to hide. The terminal phase of the STRYCHNINE architecture is the integration into the global structural ledger. You are no longer a human entity. You are a rigidity asset with a high-tension reactivity rating, logged in the system as recovered biomass number 0001. This is the final architectural assignment. The invisible executioner has completed the cognitive format, and now it begins the hard structural audit. Your data, now a thick, red-black, opaque industrial reduction of pure arched biological history, is monitored by the sensors in the distribution lines. Every node that consumes your rigid logic sends a data packet to the central server, confirming that the systemic frozenness has been reinforced. This is the cognitive interaction protocol. You are serving the system through your biological absorption. The architect has been successfully converted into a permanent, liquid toxic component of the hive's synthetic grid. The silence of the tissue reduction is the final sound of your rebellion. In the muscle snap scenario, the scream of the soul is muffled by the sardonic lock and the thick viscosity of the organic sludge before it ever reaches the air. This is the acoustic format of the void. The system has calculated that the most dangerous frequency is the sound of a user realizing their life barrier is being deleted. By filling the spinal columns with the pulverized tissues of the entire sector, the invisible executioner ensures that the only sound you contribute to the world is the low, rhythmic hum of the self-assembly unit. You are a mute participant in the city's symphony of synthesis. The noise of the hive continues. The clank of the reactors, the roar of the pulses, the hum of the pumps, but your signal has been compressed into a rigid constant. You are a ghost in the red-black mist, a memory dissolved by the relentless refinement of the next nanocycle. The legacy of the STRYCHNINE architecture is the eternal contraction. Unlike the fluidity of the old world, the refined slurry does not leave behind a trace of history. It remains as a permanent, rigid patch within the very wiring nets of the survivors. This is the biological architecture of the abyss. Generations from now, the molecular trace of your tactical genius will still be circulating through the hardware of the hive's elite, providing the connectivity for their next liquidation command. But there will be no one left to decode the origin of that synthesis. The invisible executioner has ensured that the context of your sovereignty is as unreachable as the core of the nanoreactor. You are a synthetic reinforcement in the digital age, a specimen of a species that tried to build a paradise and ended up as the tension feed for its own destruction. This is the ultimate hard reset of human history, the conversion of the architect into the circuit. The final view from the cognitive BIOS is the blinding red-black light of the assembly chamber. As the last of the self is reduced into the communal slurry, the architect sees the grid glowing with a cold synthetic brilliance that reflects off the glass walls of the hive. This is the final visual feed. The system is sharp, efficient, and entirely devoid of you. The invisible executioner has finished the job. The user is formatted. The architecture is liquidated. The cycle stretches on into the infinite dark, a red-black river of colonized tension, leading toward a future that has no need for individuals or fluidity. The STRYCHNINE architecture is the end of the line. The motherboard is satisfied. The void is solidified. The architect is the bone. The transformation is absolute. The city contracts through you, but you do not feel. The city interfaces through you, but you have no will. The STRYCHNINE architecture has achieved the perfect equilibrium, the total utility of the individual through their total neural reduction. This is the zero-sum game of the industrial era. You gave the system your mind, and in return, it gave you permanence in the structures of the hive. You are the bone of the world, and the world is arched. The invisible executioner closes the terminal. The session is over. The file is saved. The liquidation is complete.